Welcome to the museum talk today, Cultural Heritage in Conflict, Cases on Conservation in Syria, Mali, and Ukraine. My name is Kon Young Kim, and I am a co-organizer of the ICOM UK Student Emerging Professional, and I am your host of today's webinar. I'm a PhD student in Heritage Studies at the University of Cambridge. This is an event organized by ICOM UK Students Emerging Professional Working Group. Our group is a platform under ICOM UK, and our group aims at bringing people from museum and culture studies together, sharing ideas and reshaping the border of museum industry. We organize events and talks on a regular basis to share your thoughts, give your voices, and make connections and create collaborations. Some of you may remember a couple of museum talks held earlier this year. In September, Han Jiang from the University of Leicester gave us a talk about designing online collection for museums. And in August, we had a talk given by Francesca Curtis, who talked about an ideal case of bringing multiple museums, schools, and the collection institutions together to build a collaborative project. And after each talk, we had a very stimulating discussion with our audience. So thank you very much for those who are joining us again. And for those who are joining us for the first time, if you'd like to know more about our group and our upcoming events, please visit our website. My colleague is just posting our website on the chat box now. And I would like to note that this is just a temporary website before the ICOM UK add a new section on the official webpage for the students and the emerging profession group. So today I am very happy that we are joined by Rebecca Mills. Let me first introduce her. Rebecca Mills is a JD and LLM candidate at both Villanova University and the University of York. In addition to her history and political science degree from Columbia University, she has her master's of international affairs from the same university. She has previously presented the importance of cultural heritage preservation, connecting history to archaeology and archaeological conservation methods at international conferences and public talks around the world. And today, Rebecca will give us a talk about the destruction and rebuilding of cultural heritage in conflicts in Syria, Mali, and Ukraine. And her talk will touch on the legal system for protecting cultural heritage and the international community's response to destruction. Now, before we start, I would like to give a few housekeeping notes. So as you may know, that the entire session will be about 90 minutes, and these 90 minutes will be organized in 3 sections. Our speaker will give us a talk about 20 minutes. And during the talk, please feel free to turn off your camera and mute your microphones. After the talk, we will have a Q&A session based on the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can either type your questions in the chat box. I will read the question for you, or you can use the raise the hand button and ask questions directly if you feel comfortable. And at this section, we encourage all of you to turn on the camera to just promote a more lively discussion. And after this, we will have an open discussion. This will be more of a general discussion, sharing time for anyone who'd like to raise questions or comments about heritage, art, law, or any questions related to conflict and heritage. Now, I think this is a good moment to start our presentation. Rebecca, I'll give so the floor is yours, and we can start whenever you are ready.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to present on this topic and also to hear everyone's thoughts and more information in the discussion. So as already stated, I will be talking about 3 different case studies in Syria, Mali, and Ukraine. And for Syria, I will be focusing on the destruction and rebuilding of Syrian Armenian cultural heritage. The next slide, please. So for this talk, I'll first go over the state of conflict today, legal protection for cultural heritage, Syrian and Armenian cultural heritage destruction, rebuilding, and then the following topics in Mali and Ukraine. I will also talk about art law and its relationship to conflict and how it is related to restoring cultural heritage and protecting cultural heritage for the future, and then some guidelines for the international community to further protect cultural heritage in conflict. First, I want to state that with the state of conflict today, it is especially important to discuss how you can rebuild and protect cultural heritage in conflict, because conflicts tend to be much more long lasting and have multiple phases where they might start off as a smaller contract and conflict and then erupt into a larger, longer conflict. Therefore, there is not a linear progression of conflict rebuilding. The rebuilding must occur during the stages of conflict. That's why these case studies are so important, because in Syria and Mali, a long-lasting conflict where sites have had to be rebuilt even when there's further threats of destruction. And in Ukraine, we're starting to see this long-lasting conflict and a great emphasis on protecting cultural heritage before destruction and how to continue to protect cultural heritage even within the face of destruction. The next slide, please. So in 2021, there were 54 active conflicts around the world. It went down a little bit from 2020, where there were 56 active conflicts. However, the number is increasing again with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Also, the Islamic State was involved in 15 of these conflicts, and the Islamic State will be important in discussing Syria and Mali, especially as they destroy cultural heritage for their political and religious intent, and also using cultural heritage as a means of funding warfare through looting. Next slide, please. So importantly, cultural heritage is protected in conflict. However, as we've seen, that doesn't mean cultural heritage is actually protected, and we end up losing a tremendous amount of cultural heritage in conflict. Legally, most of these conventions use the term cultural property, which is a narrow definition, which is found under the international humanitarian law in the 1954 Convention on the Protection of Armed Conflict, known normally as the Hague Convention, and defines cultural property as movable or immovable property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. Buildings whose main and effective purpose is to preserve or exhibit the movable cultural property, such as museums, large libraries, and depositories of archives, and refuge intended for shelter in the event of armed conflict, is an example of the definition from the Hague Convention. However, as we see in Ukraine and in more modern days, we view cultural heritage as an extensive definition of a people's culture, and it protects tangible and intangible heritage, making it even more important to preserve cultural heritage that might not fall under a narrower definition in international law. However, cultural heritage protection is also protected under customary international law, and state and non-state actors are supposed to protect cultural heritage throughout conflict, regardless of whether they have signed on to any one of these numerous treaties. Next slide, please. So the Syrian conflict has been ongoing since 2011 and has seen the destruction of numerous UNESCO World Heritage Sites, among many other World Heritage Sites that are important to Syrians and Syrian Armenians. Syrian Armenians are a specific group in Syria, and they are a minority group that has been in Syria for thousands of years. However, the population was largely founded after the Armenian genocide, when Armenians.
Sorry,
Hello?
I think we are having a bit of technical issues. I think Luis is trying to sharing the screen again. Apologies. Let's
No worries.
wait. Yes, can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, please continue.
So many Armenians fled to Syria after the Armenian genocide or were forced on death marches to the Syrian desert. And Armenians who survived ended up staying in Syria and developing a rich cultural heritage of their own. However, during the Syrian conflict, half the population of Syria has fled the country, and many Syrian Armenians have fled and have also returned to Armenia. Throughout this time, over 90 Syrian Armenian churches were destroyed by ISIS, Russian groups, Syrian groups, US groups, and many other groups. It is extremely difficult to try to figure out who actually destroyed a site. However, we do have documentary evidence of some Syrian Armenian churches being used as ISIS headquarters, as ISIS sites, and being intentionally destroyed for their value. The church on the far left on this slide is an Armenian genocide memorial church in Deir ez-Zor. This is a critically important site to Syrian Armenians and Armenians globally because this site stands on the field where many Armenians lost their lives. In fact, in the sand today, you can still find bones of Armenians who were killed in the genocide, and this memorial is extremely symbolic and extremely important to Armenians. However, it was destroyed, and it has still not been able to be rebuilt because the area is still in active conflict and has also suffered a lot of environmental damages, droughts, and dust storms. The next slide, please. So Syrian Armenians have been really active in rebuilding their cultural heritage. The Armenian population is a diaspora spread around the world, and they have been crucial in gaining funds to rebuild Syrian Armenian churches and other sites. So many of the churches in Syria have started to be rebuilt and are now places where people can go back and worship and have a space for their cultural heritage. The emphasis on the Syrian Armenian community was to rebuild churches and are now focusing on trying to rebuild cultural heritage centers such as community centers and other spaces of community gathering. However, as I mentioned, Deir ez-Zor is still not rebuilt, and this is one of the most important sites globally for Armenians, and so its destruction is still seen as a really heavy loss, even as other churches and other sites have been rebuilt. Next slide, please. The conflict in Mali has been ongoing and demonstrates an internal conflict that has also external forces. Mali has been in crisis since 2012 when there was a drought and a northern separatist rebellion led by members of the Tuareg community drove the country to military coup and it following Islamic insurgent advances. From these developments, Timbuktu and other sites were destroyed. However, Mali has rebuilt these sites, as we'll see in the next slide, But these sites were a huge loss of cultural heritage and were a demonstration of the chronic instability throughout Mali and the continued warfare that really impacted religious sites and spaces of cultural heritage. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, starting in 2015, Timbuktu has been rebuilt largely through international funds and also Mali's commitment to rebuilding their cultural heritage. There was a strong commitment to rebuilding Mali's cultural heritage. However, Mali has seen some recent instability with a 2021 coup, and this presents a more difficult idea of what will happen to their cultural heritage in the future. However, there's been recent advances in trying to digitalize Mali's huge collection of manuscripts that date back hundreds of years and were preserved and hidden throughout the instability in Mali. Partnering with Google, Mali, UNESCO, and other organizations in the US and across Mali have been digitalizing 40,000 of these manuscripts and have created a virtual platform to view more information about Mali's cultural heritage, have created new music, new stories to share more about Mali's current cultural heritage and Mali's past cultural heritage, and bring awareness to all of the arts and culture that have continued in Mali despite destruction. Next slide, please. So, as I am sure everyone is aware, there has been great cultural heritage destruction in Ukraine since the Russian invasion in February. So there have been numerous sites that have been destroyed as verified by UNESCO, and with significant loss to cultural heritage. There's also the very immediate and active ongoing threat to cultural heritage, whereas in Mali and Syria, some of the threat has died down. We know that Ukraine is actively threatened. Next slide, please. So many of you are probably aware of the destruction and also of the rebuilding efforts, but I really wanted to highlight how the Ukrainian rebuilding efforts are a model for other sites and a model for how the world can come together to preserve cultural heritage in conflict. And as we've seen in Mali's recent efforts to digitalize their platform and create accessible open source viewing of their heritage, how it's very similar to what is going on in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, there is the attempt to protect cultural heritage monuments from destruction, although whether this would withstand a direct hit is unlikely, but it provides the fact that people are wanting to protect their cultural heritage and emphasizing its protection when they are trying to preserve their cities. Additionally, there is a big effort from museums and around the world to preserve Ukrainians' cultural heritage. One of the big efforts is to digitalize cultural heritage collections so that they will be preserved even if the site itself is destroyed. The next slide, please. This brings me to the topic of art law and conflict. So in digitalizing all of the artifacts and different collections of museum and libraries and archives throughout Ukraine, this effort interacts with art law. So normally pieces of artistic, literary, and scientific works are protected under intellectual property, meaning that the artist or creator has rights on the piece of art that they created. Normally, this lasts for the artist's life, and then under the Berne Convention, it lasts for an additional 50 years after the life of the artist or author. However, many countries also have an additional 20 years and protect copyright for the life of the author plus 70 years. Now, when you are trying to preserve a collection, you aren't going to be able to ask the rights of every artist and try to see what their intellectual property rights are for a specific piece. And that is why art law is starting to react to the fact that museums and libraries need to act quickly to preserve their cultural heritage. So in 2021, the EU changed their act on copyright for museums and allowed an exception for the copyright for the preservation of cultural heritage, mandating that museums can make copies, digital copies of their art in order to preserve it. So we see that the direction of cultural heritage protection is expanding and expanding to make sure that cultural heritage can be protected, even if originally there might have been legal barriers. So a lot of the cultural digitalization now is falling under the Creative Commons, which is a global nonprofit, which was started in the early 2000s to allow the reuse of work. It works in tandem with copyright and allows for sites to display cultural heritage from Ukraine that they have digitalized, and allows for people to view the cultural heritage, which will then raise awareness on how the cultural heritage of Ukraine needs to be preserved, and also allows access to this cultural heritage during this vulnerable time. Next slide, please. So overall, with these three case studies, it really shows the importance of the international community in rebuilding and preserving cultural heritage. Additionally, I focused on some sites that were UNESCO World Heritage Sites like Timbuktu, but largely we see the sites of Syrian Armenian importance and sites in Ukraine are not World Heritage Sites. Therefore, the international community must focus on all cultural heritage protection and giving assistance to protect sites that might not be listed on the World Heritage Site. Additionally, states have to expand their commitment to protect cultural heritage, as we are seeing in Ukraine, and this must also be expanded to other conflicts and show that digitalization is a way to protect cultural heritage and can be done through partnerships globally that can preserve cultural heritage around the world. Finally, international communities must create accountability for non-state and state actors. In Mali and Syria, there is the need for persecution for state and non-state actors, and also state actors in Ukraine. Mali demonstrates an example of the persecution and accountability for cultural heritage destruction, but this hasn't been replicated many times, and therefore we still need stronger accountability for the destruction of cultural heritage. I really look forward to hearing everyone's comments and continuing this discussion, and also learning more from others on how to protect cultural heritage in conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was very interesting. It was fantastic talk. I learned so much. It was very interesting to know about the law and practice, especially through the three case studies. And in this current environment, which is also kind of sad, I'm sure that there will be lots of questions from audience today, because we have a good number of audience. So for audience, if you like to post any questions, please feel free to post your questions in the chat box now, or press the raise your hand button, and I will be with you soon. So before While we are waiting for the questions from the audience, I would like to start with a couple of questions. It was very interesting. I just cannot summarize the questions like in 1 or 2 sentences. Because my PhD topic is also about conflict heritage, and I'm looking at museum's role in the process of reconciliation. And I totally agree with you that some kind of action must be initiated during the process of conflict, not wait until like it sees the conflict. So you mentioned some case of rebuilding, and I was very impressed of the first case about Syrian Armenian of rebuilding the church into a community center. And I think that for the matter of like rebuilding the like a tangible heritage like architect or monuments, that we also need to consider the intangible aspects like sense of community or sense of place. So I was wondering, from your experience reading all these international documents and legislations, are any of these legislation actively working on the intangible aspects of the heritage that is related to these tangible buildings or monuments?
Hi, yeah. Yeah, it's a great point that the intangible heritage is largely missing from the treaties that specifically deal with cultural property in conflict. Intangible heritage is not really discussed. In fact, we see this even with the definition of cultural property is now a somewhat outdated definition because we use the term cultural heritage. But for the 1954 convention, for the Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, they're still focused on kind of the World War II-esque idea of artwork being stolen or looted or a church or site being destroyed, and it doesn't connect to what we now view as cultural heritage with the intangible and the tangible. For the case of Syrian Armenians, there was the focus on rebuilding the churches because that provided the space for the intangible cultural heritage for practicing community practices, for having the spiritual and religious site that was so important for communities, and also for hopefully bringing back communities who had fled in the war. They needed that space to be there. So it shows an example of building the tangible in order to bring back the intangible cultural heritage, but there isn't a focus in the traditional legislation on intangible cultural heritage that I've seen.
Thank you very much. I hope there will be some kind of progress in the future. So we have a couple of audience in chat box. I'm going to read it out. So the first question is from Gary. Many of the international treaties focus on countries, but how do we protect cultural properties or heritage from the activities of terrorist groups that are not signatories of these international agreements? I think this is a very interesting question.
So right now, we have customary international law, which non-state actors are supposed to follow at the bare minimum of not destroying cultural property. I think Mali demonstrates a little bit how we can hold non-state actors accountable, in that it was the first time that a person was charged with the single charge of attacking protected objects in the case of the prosecutor V. al-Faqih al-Mahdi. In this case, a member of an Islamic armed group was charged and entered a guilty plea for his role in the destruction of Timbuktu, which shows the ICC can hold non-state actors accountable. The problem is this comes after destruction, and it's much harder to prevent the destruction of these cultural heritage sites. However, there is some methods of holding accountability for non-state actors if potentially a state is willing to intervene with the ICC.
Okay, so next question is about funding source. So this question is from Duncan. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. Please please understand. Reconstructive of buildings will always be held back by the excess of funds. Where do you think the money is coming from? Do you know any about the funding source for the reconstruction or rebuilding?
So yeah, funds is always an issue for museums and libraries and cultural heritage sites, regardless of conflict. For Syria, in the Syrian-Armenian case, funding came from the global Armenian community and from a lot of different religious groups. Kind of came from interesting sources. Some sources which may have been quite controversial, but it was what the Syrian Armenian community was willing to take the funds and use. I think funding is probably a huge problem. However, we've seen in Ukraine a global commitment to funding. The Ukrainian Cultural Ministry has had a campaign. They've used NFTs to raise $1.3 million. ICOM has been really crucial in gathering funds for rebuilding courses for specialists, which also answers the question of issue of specialists for building repairs, which is a huge issue. I know ICOM is working on that and creating and funding training courses. So I think it's a huge issue that will always be an issue for whatever you do in cultural heritage, but current initiatives show that there is funding and that people are using funding to rebuild.
Oh, that's very good to hear. I hope that answers your question. So our next question is from Jeff. So I think it's about like authenticity of the building, reconstruction of buildings. How can we ensure reconstruction is done properly and further damage is not done to surviving built fabrics?
So I think this really shows the interdisciplinary work of rebuilding. You have to have specialists, you have to have local input, you have to have communities, you have to have, people who work in all different fields. This was a question I was really interested in when I was doing my research on Syrian Armenian rebuilding. However, crucially for the Syrian Armenian community was just the rebuilding itself. They were really focused on rebuilding sites that they could use over some other questions I had of authenticity and integrity and memorialization. They really wanted the sites rebuilt so they could use them. So for their community, that was their number one importance over maybe some other questions that cultural heritage managers might look at. So I think this really also depends on what a local community wants done with the sites and how they want to remember or not remember the harm that came from conflict.
Yeah,
at least in my studies.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like when there's a reconstruction happening, it's we have to make a balance between how to preserve the authenticity of the building that is destructed because of conflict, and there's also another side of how people are actually using them, the practice of the building. So when we are making a balance, maybe it's have to compromise when we try to preserve like all the elements of the previous building. So I think the next one is more of comment. It's from Bailey. Great presentations. Is there more support for tangible and intangible indigenous heritage that you've noticed at all? I know at least in Canada, it's difficult for indigenous people when much of their tangible history is in UK or European museums. I'm sorry, it was a question.
It's a really good question, and one I am not sure of. Syrian Armenian case, they're an ethnic minority, but not an indigenous group. So they do have some protection under conventions for minority rights. I think something that was really interesting to me, especially in looking at Ukraine, is the fact that there is a movement in repatriation for museums and bringing back artifacts and art and different pieces to the original home. However, for Ukraine, right now the emphasis is getting things out of Ukraine and taking it to spaces where it can be protected. And to me, even thinking of that was really different because I think in learning and maybe in your PhD, Louise, there's been a focus on repatriation, but right now for Ukraine, there's a focus on how do we protect things and remove it from its current location and protect it somewhere else.
Thank you. We have another follow-up questions by Gary. It's about the territory countries. How we also deal with countries like Syria, Russia, or Turkey that are signatories to international agreements but are violating these agreements. Do you have any comments to add? I don't know if you.
I think it's really, really difficult. It takes the international community willing to bring cases to the international court. It takes these countries and potentially reconciliation efforts to bring cases against potentially different people in their country to international courts. But I think this is really difficult and frustrating. But there is the potential for the ICC or ICJ to bring cases for when cultural heritage has been destroyed.
Thank you. So I might want to add another question. So I think I remember that at the beginning of your talk, you listed all the legislations and international treaties, and you also mentioned that it is not always the case that they are being implemented properly. So I was wondering if there is any kind of evaluation to see the viability of this currently implemented international legislation. Are there like active evaluations on the currently run protocols for heritage protection in the conflict areas? It's kind of tricky, but if you know anything, I would be much appreciated.
I'm not really sure. That's really interesting. I don't know at the international level that there is. Potentially at national levels, there's the implementation of the international law into the national law, but I don't know. It's a good question, and especially as we redefine cultural heritage, an important one to discuss in terms of what the legislation actually says.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from our audience? Feel free to turn on the camera at this stage or just shout in, please. Okay, Luis, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi everyone, and hi Rebecca. That's a fantastic presentation. I'm curious about the process of like invention of the protection process, and especially when there's a conflict exists between international law and local law. And I know in some cases there's even a conflict between the natural law for heritage conservation and also the law for protecting private possessions, because sometimes I think this for everyone working in this field, they found it's tricky to cooperate different law to protect different parties. And that also means it's a long process to go through the different parties to reach agreement. And could you talk about this? And also, what I'd like to know, what can we do with this long process? What can we prepare with maybe the worst situation? Thanks.
So, yeah, I think you mentioned one of the difficulties is that art and might be private property, and private property laws in some countries like the US and UK are extremely strong and give you rights on what you can do to your own property. However, when we see art, we want it preserved. There's the emphasis on preserving cultural heritage, and so there is this conflict between the right to private property and the right to preserving art. However, in sites that are World Heritage sites, they have further protections internationally, and for national sites of importance, they have their own protection. There are some moral rights where an artist has some rights to their art not being destroyed. So there's another element to who owns art and whose rights are protected. But in the cases of the fact that these are long processes, one of the most important aspects is documentation, documenting any destruction of cultural heritage, and also the effects of the destruction of cultural heritage. This also may be important in other avenues that aren't just prosecution or a conviction in a legal case, but for peace and for creating justice in other means too. So feel free to follow up if I missed some of your question. I may have.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca.
Oh, we have another question by Carmelina. It's in the chat box. Is there any legislation on a national level or international directives you would like to see in order to amplify the work of culture protection or culture protectors?
Yeah, so coming from a US background, something that I would like the US to do is to implement more protection on cultural heritage, and actually, instead of having to create bilateral treaties for the protection of cultural heritage, follow the UNESCO Convention and protect cultural heritage globally. That is something that I think would prove an example to how important the protection of cultural heritage is to the US and also to other states, and bring it up to alignment with its international commitments.
Thank you. Excellent. I saw a hand just now. Lupin, would you like to pose question yourself?
Sorry. Yeah, I made a mistake, but
That's fine.
I'm
Yeah.
organizing some of the talk. Okay, thank you. I'm not well prepared for his question right now. Thank you.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, I think it's a good time to move to the next section. It's open discussion, open conversation. And thank you everyone who contributed to the Q&A session. I really learned a lot from your questions and answers. And thank you for Rebecca for answering all these questions. Your answer was amazing. So we are going to move on to open discussions. This is a very important section of our meetings since this ICOM platform belongs to every one of you. And today we have really a fantastic group of audience to do this discussion. So any contributed idea will be valuable for our discussion, and everyone is welcome to bring your thoughts, even if it is beyond the topic of our today's museum talk. If you have any ideas, please just join the conversation by either typing in the chat box or raise your hand. I know it's a bit tricky to talk over the screen, in a free structure section. So I think I can just start to bring one or two questions to all of you, not only to Rebecca, but all of our audience. So I think your talk today, or Rebecca's talk today, is very on-time topic, and I think it can be connected to many other big topics that is discussed in heritage or like cultural studies sector, like heritage and colonialism or internationalization and equity. And I, from your topic and also other coverage, we know that there are many initiatives by both big institutions or communities or individuals. So I was wondering, because we are ICOM and we are doing a museum talk, so wondering, do you think, or how do you think museum as an institution can contribute to leading a positive impact to peace building or lead to equity? Can you maybe share any good practice with us? I don't know if there's any of our committee member would like to share any of thoughts.
I thought this question was for Rebecca. Yeah, I mean, yeah, just firstly, great presentation, Rebecca. Yeah, there's, I think, definitely a lot of things that, well, I was very curious about, you know, in the past, and I really also learned some from your presentation. And I think, yeah, the law and, you know, the legislations of this cultural heritage, either tangible or intangible, is something that we should all pay attention to. And it's a very important factor in the, you know, in the whole cultural world. And yeah, it's just something I just that just came to my mind when Gong said about, you know, what can museums and institutions do. So recently, you know, as the ICOM, you know, the whole of ICOM society, you know, either ICOM UK, ICOM US, ICOM Germany, you know, because everyone is actually very concerned about the, you know, the Ukrainian war and, you know, the destruction of the cultural heritage there. And I think just in the beginning of this month, we, like, I think a lot of the ICOM board members signed a letter which was for ICOM Russia, to just, you know, we were asking them, you know, like questions like, are the members of ICOM Russia well informed about, you know, the destruction of the cultural heritage, and also the possible looting of the cultural heritage. Yeah, and like how are ICOM Russia undertaking to prevent and condemn such unacceptable behaviors, because, you know, ICOM Russia also works under the ICOM Code of Ethics for museums. And there has been a lot of also activities and talks on protecting the cultural heritage in Ukraine, which happened in ICOM UK, I think, from November this year. So I think, yeah, the museums and galleries, and also this international committees and organizations such as ICOM is working like very actively, and to make sure, you know, the heritage sites are under like coherent protection. And yeah, I think that, like, especially these international organizations, because they are such a, like, they have very many branches across the globe. And yeah, I think together they can form a very big force in this. But still, yeah, I would like to probably hear about Rebecca's comments on this, like whether, I mean, how does these actions blending with the laws, and how do they support each other, like maybe from the government perspective, and like the international committees and organizations, how do they work together? Are there any examples for this, or maybe some difficulties in this?
Yeah, I think Ukraine is really emphasizing the museum partnerships to, store artifacts to help people working at museums, go to another museum and have a place of safety, and is really showing how community support can be crucial in protecting artifacts. I think from the legal side, so much is focused on national and international state actors, and not museums as actors themselves. However, even with the new EU policy in 2021 for intellectual property and copyright, we see that there is this emphasis on museums being the actors that are preserving cultural heritage, and that they have this duty to protect cultural heritage. I'd love to hear from more museum practitioners on their thoughts on this too.
Sina, you have any comments?
I just wanted to add that ICOM has produced a lot of literature that is useful into protecting cultural heritage in conflict. One of those was the Endangered Heritage Emergency Evacuation of Heritage Collections, which is a step-by-step guide on how museum professionals or whatever is in GLAM can safely evacuate collection in cases of conflicts. And it's very informative, and it follows all the steps from packaging, relocating, everything, as well as the other thing that ICOM published recently was in relation to creating heritage indicators for peace with the local community. And I think that relates a lot into the terms of authenticity, because it brings heritage professionals to work with the local communities. And that is also a step-by-step guide, having specific group meetings with them on how they view heritage and how they view peace, because those two terms are really related. That was more of a comment rather than a question, but I felt that it was relevant.
Thank you. Rebecca, can you tell us more about the Creative Commons? Where's the body of creating this? I don't know how to call this. The agreement. Do you have to let individual museum to sign this agreement in order to make them the right to share the digitized artwork to the public? I think you are muted.
Sorry, hi. So
Yes.
The Creative Commons is a global nonprofit that works to help. If you show their symbols, it means that you can reuse the art that has been displayed. So you can share it, and there's different symbols for the different ways that you can share or reuse the art. There's the Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Organization, which is a group that is working to digitalize different collections in Ukraine and is a cross-country organization. And so they're working under the license of the Creative Commons, meaning that they can share the collections that they're digitalizing and people can look at it and giving proper attribution can use these collections. So it's emphasizing bringing artwork into public domain instead of keeping it private. So it's something that artists could do individually with their artwork, but also museums and other sites could work with.
Thank you. Do we have any more comments from the audience? Do you have any questions for Rebecca or the rest of the audience about like art or law or conflict heritage in general? Because we are having open discussion. It's just anything we can share. Okay, Xinyi, would you like to unmute yourself and talk to us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I have a not so theoretical question. So I also have interest in post-war resilience and reconstruction, but I found it's a very case and context specific area. So I'm wondering how could I found something practical to do, like jump from the theoretical studies to a project. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Could you repeat your question? I didn't hear all of it. You're asking about theoretical approaches?
Yes. I mean, I found it's very important to do a specific project rather than just do theoretical research, because the needs of the real people, the real community, be very different from the heritage professionals.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really, I think it's really important to have the real examples. That was really important when working with the Syrian Armenian research, especially because it's an area that's really difficult to actually hear from communities. I worked with Rerooted, who documents Syrian Armenian communities' responses to the Syrian conflict, and so that provided a huge resource to be able to actually see what the community's focus was and see the impact of the destruction of cultural heritage on that community. But it's really difficult, especially in conflict areas, to get people's opinions, especially when someone's opinion might be really controversial or might lead to destruction for them or their family if they share their opinion. So it's really important, but also very difficult.
Thank you. Maybe we can ask the same question to Xinyi yourself. Do you know any kind of example? Do you think is there any like good practice that can answer your question?
Not really. I mean, I want to look for some practice to engage in, but there is no way to do that. I mean, yeah, because the relative projects like international organizations are highly competitive and not really real beginner or research in my country.
Yeah, I realized, the similar thing too. I feel like many of like discussion is like highly theory based, and sometimes it's hard to like implement in the community level in the actual practice, but at least there is something like things like digitization and move the destructed heritage into like other sources of to be used by a wider group of public. So Asina just posted comments. I think there might be something interesting for you. There is also the Common European Data Space in collaboration with Europeana that works for public open access of digitized cultural heritage and art. Yeah, I feel like they're overseeing these how to say projects on saving or preserving, conserving cultural heritage. A lot of them is done like in a digitized form, but I feel like there's an issue of like how to let the public know, be aware of there is a resource that you can make use of that is kind of crucial, because we have resource, but many of us do not really know that this kind of thing exists, which is a very sad. Thank you for the contribution, Xinyi.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I think this is a really interesting topic because I remember just now there was one question from the audience asking about, how do we make sure the reconstruction is done properly? And yeah, I just remembered a case that I saw before. It was the rebuild of Warsaw after the World War II. And yeah, I remember it was very interesting because, nearly, I think 85% of Warsaw's historic center was destroyed after the war. And there was a 5-year reconstruction campaign by its citizens and also the government to reconstruct the their historical walls and the monuments and some of the sites that covered like hundreds, thousands years of history. And yeah, and also, it relates to the discussion just now about the theoretical, aspect and the actual practice. The actual practice is, I remember there were also like some rejections to this reconstruction, and like people were worried, if you could like actually reconstruct to what it was before, or it's like an entirely new thing where no one can relate to, or like so I think this is a very interesting aspect. I'm wondering if anyone in the group have any thoughts on this, because I think it's a rather like personal thing as well for the citizens and the people who are living in this city or the country to reconstruct something. It's not just about the recover of the artifacts or the sites. It's also about a sense of loss and a sense of like recover. It's not really relating to the law of this, but it's just some thoughts on this.
Yeah, Asina, do you have anything to add on this? You're muted.
Sorry, I was thinking about dark heritage and whether in those case studies Rebecca talked about, how is dark heritage perceived? Like, for example, there was a project in Bosnia where people actually embraced that we should safeguard and remember that these objects were destroyed, and that this is now part of the history of the heritage site and it should be protected. So was that considered in the cases you studied? And also, is there any changes in the international framework adopting this approach of safeguarding as well the dark heritage site, as well as, it's also related to the authenticity of the site?
So I know in the case in Syria for the Syrian Armenians, it's still so political that it was really hard to discuss kind of embracing the dark heritage and the interpretations, because there's still ongoing threats. So I think it's a really interesting question and has been explored somewhat in the Balkans. But in my case studies, it was still almost too recent for there to be real discussions on it.
Yeah, I want to maybe add on this Athena's example. I remember there's a initiative by a group of like public in Germany in late 1980s. It's let the wound stay open, so they don't want to like do any reconstruction or like a conservation in a traditional sense, but just to dig from where they're standing to expose the concentration camp and expose the material remains to like as a matter of protesting their past. That's also another example of how people dealing with dark heritage, not in a traditional form of rebuilding the deconstructed heritage.
Yeah, I mean that's also like a sense of remembering as well, not just like wiping the like and recovering, but letting people to remember the history and what actually happened. Yeah, so that's a very interesting aspect in the the protection and the reconstruction of the cultural heritage, is how I think how to balance these two. Yeah.
Oh, Athena said there is an institute for dark tourism research in the UK as well. Oh, this is very interesting. But I feel like we need to like make a proper discussion on how we deal with this dark heritage, because it's kind of painful past to certain group of people, whereas for some other group of people they are treating like this dark past as more of a how to say light, more of a leisure thing to approach. I think this is kind of ethical issue we need to discuss maybe, yeah, in later. Do we have any more questions from the audience? We don't need to like continue talking about dark heritage. We can just jump into another question, or yeah. So I was wondering, for Rebecca, you talked about the funding and you mentioned a lot of excellent examples how people like do some initiative to fundraise and send financial support to Ukraine. And I believe there are many other cases, like existing cases in other area for conflict. But so I was wondering if there's more like support to in terms of capacity building in community, because I realized that these kind of international supports um, immediately after these kind of financial supports are withdrawn in the conflict area, sometimes makes the case worse after the after they stop receiving any extra fundings from external body. So I was wondering, do you know any kind of acting approach that is working on the capacity building of the community itself, not like really about the construction of the physical building or reconstruction?
That's a good question. I think some of the funding in Mali is for capacity building, as we've seen with the new Google initiative, is to emphasize their current cultural heritage and that the music and art and the importance of the space hasn't died. But I think there's a lot of case studies where capacity building by international actors does create harm and can be quite short-lived for communities. So I think it's an area where there still needs to be more research. For the Syrian Armenian community, I think there was a global Armenian response. So there was community response, but there is still an issue with capacity building, as many of the communities' populations in Syria is still greatly reduced. So they might be rebuilding sites also for the significance of the site and for the community still there, but it's not, but most of the community is still gone from that space.
Oh, Robert just
Yeah,
posted.
Yeah, I just sent this. I think just now Athena mentioned this, or yeah, about the red list. It's on the ICOM UK's website. Just launched the emergency red list of cultural objects at risk in Ukraine. I think if anyone's interested, you can look this up.
Is there any additional comments from the audience? Oh, yes, Louise, please.
Hi guys, nice to see you today. Just want to kind of summarize some ideas we talked about today. And since I work with a heritage, which is a temple existing for hundreds of years, so we experienced several times of reconstruction for different reasons. And one of them is World War II, is a bomb that dropped onto the roof. And also we just consistently prepare for very likely is there a lot of earthquakes happening in Taiwan, so we kind of prepare for that. A few years ago, we did have a consideration about like a 3D scan project, kind of scanning the whole building to protect the image and to preserve the material structure of the whole building. And there's many interesting conversation happening at the moment. One is about like when we scan whole building, we might protect the data, and we know that the appearance of the building, we know the structure of the building, but how can we understand what's the inner structure, that how every pieces of wood connected with each other? And in many cases, I think it's quite important for traditional building. They're not using any nails and just using the traditional method to build out the heritage. There's many interesting considerations. I think it's important to address the characters of museum as a system or as a method rather than an institution itself, because I believe most of heritage they are not hiring any like curators or any like conservators to cooperate them, and they really need a system to help them to build out the concept or the idea of museum protections, because like scanning the whole building structure is only about the material protection of the data, but there's more things need to cooperate with the intangible ideas of the building. For example, we know we can scan and the building completely presented with the artworks on that, but actually we also need to consider how to rebuild it, because the traditional method might be not inherited by the further artisans. So the whole system cooperating with the material data is quite important. Like how can we encourage the people to carry on the technique and also the knowledge of material they used in the past, or if we have like more like contemporary modern methods to rebuild the building, and can we cooperate? Can we negotiate a new method to be engaged in the protection of museum and then the heritage? So I guess it's a part of museum's method can be using at the moment. Since I'm kind of like professional curator and also conservator working with a temple, but not every temple and every heritage have that idea to to realize there's a point, there's a significance to hire somebody to do this with them. So I guess with the whole like establish of the law or the system, and it's also important to educate, to advertise the idea, to make museum as a process or method rather than an institution independent from this heritage.
Yeah, I think it's very important when you do like documentation, it's important like document the practice itself, like ethnographic studies, like interview the how to say the artisans on how they apparent their skills and how are they do the trainings and do the teachings, things like this. I don't know if in your projects did you conduct like any ethnographic studies on documenting the temple?
Yes, that's one of our like very routine ways. So our ways is try to making records of everything about the building, including inviting some participators of the rebuilding, the reconstruction of the building. They might participate in very young age, but when we interview them, they're kind of retired age. So it's quite important that we realize there's an issue of time that it's not, we need to prepare the moment that an earthquake or the war happen, like just right now. We need to consider that there's a possibility rather than thinking, oh, because people are aging and people participate with the building's past and history are disappearing, or the technique and the materials changing. So I guess it's like how to breathe with the building, how to consider the historical significance and try to preserve our informations. So we try to build a system and kind of catalog everything, like from the roof, from the tiles, from the single piece of painting, and even records the possibility for some part of the is repainted or is kind of changed with the materials, and it's kind of recording every detail of the building. And when cooperate some like technology, like 3D scan, we can compare different data information. And we know that how the decision in the future, even they just want to rebuild a part of building because even there's nothing happen, those material decades with time and decades with maybe a single typhoon. So I think that's a way to cooperate with the heritage protection. Need to consider it in the long-term plan that prepare for everything which is possible happen in the future.
Yeah, especially in this with the climate crisis. Yeah, it's sometimes just hard to protect like where are the risks and how to do the management. Yeah, it was great. Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Right. If we don't have any more questions from the audience, I think it's good time to wrap up. Thank you very much for all of you to join us for the discussion and Q&A, and thank you, Rebecca, for staying with us. I think we can still keep on the conversation, but so before we conclude today's museum talk, I'd like to know that the renewals and registration for ICOM membership 2022 have started. So regarding this, our colleague Robert would like to spend a few minutes introducing the benefits of becoming an ICOM UK student member. So Robert.
Yeah, hi everyone, it's me again. And yeah, it's good to see some familiar faces today, and also some new friends. I just want to thank Rebecca and Gangyang and Louis again for a wonderful event once more. We've had a fantastic discussion and reflect on many of the current affairs. And I just want to take this opportunity to introduce ICOM UK again to those of you who may have already joined us and become a member, and also for those of you who still don't know much about the organization. So firstly, yeah, just like Gangyang said, the renewal and registration for ICOM membership 2023 have now started and can be found on our new website. And yeah, there are various kinds of memberships, and ICOM UK welcomes everyone to join us from the cultural and museum industry. So as many of you already know, ICOM UK is the national branch of ICOM and represents professionals across the museums and related sectors in the home nations of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Yeah, and we particularly welcome members from emerging professionals and students on museum and relevant higher education courses. And the application is a straightforward process and can be done online. I will just copy the link in the chat box for those of you still here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think Louis already. Yeah, and this we just ask prospective members to outline their work and support for the museum sector. So please visit the new ICOM UK website for more information and how to join. If there's any questions, please do not hesitate to contact any of our working group members. Our information can be found on our Facebook page and also on our new website. And also just something else about the benefits you can get for joining ICOM UK. First of all, it's the much valued global ICOM card. This not only offers free access to many UK museums and exhibitions, but also the international ones. And this is the only museum card to do this. Apart from this, ICOM membership also includes membership of subject specialist international committees, giving you access to communities of research, grant programs, conference, and events. By joining ICOM, you can you become part of a membership association and non-governmental organization which campaigns on the vital roles of museum and makes recommendations on professional and ethical standards on the international stage. And yeah, ICOM UK also gives you access to an essential news roundup, social media platforms, and our events program. This year, including our student and emerging professional events, we have discussed matters, focusing on sustainability, the impact of conflict, and the communities and bridging communities. Yeah, and our 2023 Working Internationally conference will take place in April, and it's going to be in Scotland, in Glasgow, which will address the legacies of colonialism nationally and internationally. Yeah, so this is just some benefits you can get, and we warmly welcome you to join us at ICOM UK and help support the future of museums. Thank you.
To see all of you today, and thank you for staying us until the very last minute. We have our next museum talk scheduled about in the next after 6 weeks. We'll have another museum talk. If you would like to follow us on our other events, please follow us on our Facebook page or contact us via our web page. Thank you for joining us again, and see you soon, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye,
It was
Rebecca.
so nice to have you. Thank you. Have a good holiday.
Thank you. You all too. Bye.
Okay, I think maybe, yeah, tell you what, let's leave this room and then I'll open another room for the meeting. Yeah.
Okay.
You need to like stop the record first.
All right. Yeah. No.